12 years ago, I made a promise to myself after a rough spring. I was 64, recovering from a hip that wasn't cooperating, and I told myself if I couldn't dig a new bed every year, I'd find something worth growing that I'd never have to plant again. That promise led me to 5 herbs that have been in the same corner of my garden ever since, coming back on their own every single spring. No digging, no replanting, no trip to the nursery. I still cook with every one of them weekly. These aren't the trendy herbs you see in a fancy cooking show, the ones that need a heated greenhouse or constant fussing. They're the 5 that actually survive neglect, survive winter, and survive a gardener who doesn't always have the energy to fuss over them, because most weeks, I don't. Here's exactly which 5 and how I set them up so I never have to bend down to any of them. Let's start with the one that anchors the whole bed, rosemary. This is a woody perennial, which means once it's established, the plant itself turns into a small shrub with a permanent root system, not something you're starting from seed each spring. In milder climates, roughly zone 7 and warmer, it stays outdoors year-round without any protection at all. What surprised me most about rosemary wasn't how it grows, it's how little it wants from me. It's Mediterranean by nature, which means it actually prefers to be a little neglected. Too much water is the fastest way to kill it, not too little. I planted mine at the back corner of my waist-high raised bed 12 years ago, and I've watered it maybe once a week through the driest stretches of summer and otherwise left it entirely alone. It's now nearly 3 feet across, and every single time I cook, I reach over, snap off a sprig at exactly elbow height, and I'm done. No kneeling, no cutting tools, just my fingers. There's one habit worth building with rosemary specifically, because it's the plant most people get wrong, and it cost me a whole season the first time I got it wrong myself. Never cut into old, brown, woody stems hoping for new growth. Rosemary almost never resprouts from wood that old, and you'll end up with a bare stick where a healthy branch used to be. Always cut into the soft, green growth from the current or previous year, an inch or 2 below the tip. I lost nearly a third of my original plant that first winter by hacking it back too hard, too low, thinking I was tidying it up the way you would a hedge. Light, frequent snips from the green tips instead of one big cutback each year, and the plant just keeps producing. The second one solves a completely different problem: height, or rather, the lack of it. Thyme grows low, almost like a ground cover, spreading maybe 8 to 12 inches wide and staying just a few inches tall. That sounds like the opposite of no-bend gardening until you see where I actually planted it, right along the front edge of my raised bed, cascading slightly over the side. I never have to reach down into the bed for it, because it grows right at the lip, at exactly the height my hand naturally falls when I'm standing at that bed with my morning coffee. Thyme is hardy in zone 4 and colder, tougher than almost anything else in this list, and it handles being walked past, brushed against, even lightly stepped on without complaint. I use it constantly in soups and roasted vegetables, and I've never once had to think about whether it survived winter. It just does. There are actually a few different types worth knowing about. Creeping thyme stays lowest and spreads fastest, while English thyme grows in slightly taller, denser clumps, closer to a foot high. I planted creeping thyme along the very front lip of the bed, and a small clump of English thyme a foot back from it. So I get both the ground cover spread and a slightly bushier plant for heavier cooking use, all within arm's reach of the same spot. Third is oregano. And this is the one that solves the budget question before anyone even asks it in the comments, because I know somebody will. Oregano spreads on its own through underground runners, which means after your first year, you can dig up a small clump in early spring, divide it into 2 or 3 sections with nothing more than your hands or a butter knife, and replant those sections elsewhere in the bed. I've never bought a second oregano plant in 12 years. Every patch in my garden today came from that same original plant, divided a piece at a time. If money's tight this year, and you can only afford one herb start from the nursery, make it oregano. Within 2 seasons, you'll have enough to fill an entire bed, and enough to hand cuttings to a neighbor besides. It also flowers through midsummer, small clusters of white or pale purple blooms, and I let a portion of mine flower every year rather than cutting it all back for the kitchen, because the bees in my yard show up for it in numbers I never see anywhere else in the garden. That's not just a nice bonus. A patch of flowering oregano near my tomato bed means more pollinators working the whole yard, not just the herb corner. There's one more propagation trick worth mentioning while I'm on the topic of getting more plants for free, because it works on thyme too, not just oregano. Creeping thyme roots itself naturally wherever a low stem touches soil, a process called layering. If you want to expand your patch without dividing the whole plant, just pin a low-growing stem down against bare soil nearby with a bent piece of wire or even a small rock. Keep that spot lightly moist for a few weeks, and it'll send down its own roots right there. Once it has, snip it free from the parent plant, and you've got a second plant for the cost of nothing but a little patience. I've filled an entire second bed edge this way over the years, without ever buying another thyme plant after that first one. But none of these 5 herbs matter if you plant them the way most gardeners plant annual vegetables, in soil that's too rich and too wet, which is the single fastest way to lose a perennial herb bed before it ever gets established. More on exactly what these 5 actually want from your soil in just a minute. Quick one before I keep going. Which of these 5 do you already have growing? Drop the name below. I read every comment. One thing worth clearing up before I go further, because it trips people up constantly in the comments on other herb videos. Not every herb belongs on a list like this one. Basil, cilantro, and dill are the 3 most common herbs gardeners plant, and all 3 are annuals, meaning they grow, flower, set seed, and die within a single season, no matter where you live or how well you care for them. There's nothing wrong with growing them. I do every year myself, but don't expect them to come back on their own the way these 5 will. If a nursery tag or a seed packet doesn't say perennial or list a hardiness zone range, assume it's an annual and budget for replanting it every spring. That one distinction alone will save you from wondering every autumn why half your herb bed vanished and the other half didn't. Here's the soil piece, and it surprises a lot of folks coming from vegetable gardening, because it's the opposite of what tomatoes want. Where a tomato bed wants rich compost and frequent feeding, these 5 herbs actually prefer lean, well-drained soil with very little added fertilizer at all. I mix in a generous handful of coarse sand or fine gravel when I first plant any of them, right into the existing bed soil, specifically to improve drainage rather than richness. I feed this bed maybe once a year, in early spring, with a light dusting of compost, nothing more. Overfeeding a Mediterranean herb like rosemary or oregano actually makes the flavor weaker and the plant floppier, more prone to rot in a wet winter. Less really is more here, which honestly makes this the easiest bed in my entire garden to maintain, because doing less is exactly what the plants want from you. 4th on the list is chives, and if you're gardening somewhere genuinely cold, this is the one I'd point you to first. Chives are hardy down into Zone 3, which covers nearly the entire continental US and most of Canada besides. They die back completely in winter, disappearing right down to the soil line, and then push back up on their own the moment the ground warms in spring. Reliable as clockwork, without me doing a single thing in between. I grow mine right at the same front edge as the thyme, and I snip what I need with kitchen scissors, standing straight up, never once bending toward the ground. The trick to keeping chives productive all season is cutting them the right way. Snip the whole leaf down to about 2 inches above the soil, rather than just trimming the tips, and it regrows fuller and faster than if you'd only taken the top half. The flowers are edible too, a soft purple puff you can scatter over a salad, and the plant only gets better the more you cut from it through the season. Every 3rd year or so, mine gets crowded enough in the center that I dig up the whole clump, split it into 2 or 3 smaller clumps the same way I do with oregano, and replant them with a little breathing room. That's the only maintenance chives ever ask for, and it's optional even then. Quick one, if you've made it this far with me, drop the word chives below, It genuinely helps this video find more folks like us. The fifth and last is sage, and this is the one that actually needs a little maintenance. So I want to be honest about that instead of pretending every plant on this list is entirely hands-off. Sage is a hardy perennial, reliable down to about zone 4, but it has a habit of turning woody and sparse in the center after 3 or 4 years if you never touch it. The fix is simple, and it only takes a few minutes once a year, in early spring, before new growth really gets going. I cut it back by about a third, right at that same waist height where the whole plant sits, using the same lightweight pruning shears I use everywhere else in the garden. That one small cut each spring is the difference between a sage plant that keeps producing thick, usable leaves for a decade and one that turns into a bare, woody stick by year 5. I grow common garden sage, the broad gray-green leaf variety you'll find at any nursery, over the fancier ornamental types, simply because it's the hardiest and the most forgiving if I forget the yearly trim one spring, which has happened more than once. It's the only real chore in this entire bed, and it takes less time than making a cup of coffee. One thing worth knowing before winter hits, especially if you're anywhere colder than zone 6, a little bit of protection goes a long way with this group. I don't do anything elaborate. Once the first hard frost is behind us and the plants have died back for the season, I lay a loose 4-inch layer of straw mulch over the whole bed, just pulled from a bale I keep in the shed. No special product needed. It insulates the roots through the coldest stretches without smothering the plant. And I pull it back away from the crowns in early spring the moment I see new growth pushing up. Leaving mulch piled against the crown too long in spring can actually cause rot, so that timing matters more than people expect. Thyme, oregano, chives, and sage all handle a straw-mulched winter without complaint, even in genuinely cold climates. Rosemary is the one exception here. In anything colder than zone 7, it genuinely won't survive outdoors no matter how well you mulch it. So if you're in a cold climate and you want rosemary specifically, grow it in a container you can bring indoors to a sunny window for winter, rather than in the ground with the other 4. I've done exactly that with a backup rosemary plant for the past 4 winters, and it comes back out to the patio every May, none the worse for it. And if you're working with containers instead of a ground bed entirely, every single one of these 5 does well in a pot, with one adjustment worth knowing. Thyme and oregano actually prefer it, since a container naturally gives them the sharp drainage they're already looking for. Group 2 or 3 together in one wide, shallow container rather than separate deep pots, since none of these have particularly deep root systems, and a wide, shallow pot is easier to lift, move, and manage than several narrow ones scattered around a patio. I'd keep rosemary and sage in their own separate pots though. Even in a container setup, both grow into genuinely large, woody shrubs over the years. 3 feet across isn't unusual for rosemary, and they'll crowd out the smaller herbs if you try to share a container long term. Set any of these pots on a wheeled caddy from the start before the plant fills in and gets heavy, so moving them for sun or winter shelter never turns into a 2-person job. One question I get constantly, and I want to answer it directly instead of dancing around it. Will all 5 of these actually survive where you specifically garden? To recap plainly, chives and thyme are the toughest of the group, hardy into zone 3, so nearly anyone reading this can grow those 2 in the ground with 0 winter protection beyond that straw mulch. Oregano and sage both handle zone 4 and colder reliably. Rosemary is the outlier, and I'd rather tell you that plainly than have you lose one and think you did something wrong. Anything colder than zone 7, grow it in a container and bring it in for winter, full stop. If you're not sure what zone you're in, a quick search of your zip code and USDA hardiness zone will tell you in about 10 seconds, and it's worth doing once before you plant any perennial, herb, or otherwise. I put the exact spacing, the pruning schedule for sage, and the soil mix I use for this entire bed into a free checklist. Links right below if you want the shortcut instead of trial and error like I had.